Alrighty. I'm just gonna keep going and making these videos until I can't make them anymore. But I'll like try and space them out so then I can, then you guys can sort of be like, oh, what happens next? Um, which, yeah. Yesterday, I forgot to take a picture of it, but I literally almost cried in the Walmart store because so our baby's theme was going to be like llamas, and I don't know what if you've heard of the book Llama Llama, but there was these bibs that said Llama Llama, I love my grandma, and I was like, oh my gosh. Like, I kind of like wanted to impulsively buy them, but also I was like so sad. And I'm pretty sure the couple with their kid was like, why is this lady almost crying? Like, what's going on? You know. So, chapter 2 is called Hello, Deep Dive. It's said that having children is like having your heart walk around outside of your body. If that's true, it's no wonder miscarriage feels like having part of your heart missing. My heart has been exposed to this phenomenon for over 7 years now. First with the birth of 2 sons, then with the trauma of 3 miscarriages, and then again during the physically difficult and emotionally fraught pregnancy and delivery of our youngest son. 6 pregnancies to practice the deep dive. I'm still learning how to go deep enough. When I became pregnant for the first time, my heart came alive with possibility. I loved being with child and was proud of my growing belly. I was healthy, happy, active, and full of expectation. I treasured pregnancy as the only time I wouldn't have to share my little one with the world, and enjoyed rearranging my life around this tiny growing piece of my heart. Motherhood was changing me already. It felt good and right. That definitely, like, you have so many cares. You start thinking about all those things, like, oh my gosh, like, how are you going to do this, or how are you going to do that, and like, when should I worry about this, and your life literally, like, you're so excited, and you want to share with others, like, I'm pregnant, because it's exciting. But Levi was born after 12 hours of labor in a swift emergency cesarean section. He was perfect, and I was drunk on love. Although the hardest, most exhausting work of my life, motherhood was everything I'd hoped for. My heart was ablaze. I was born for this. A year later, we conceived our next child, Judah, as soon as we began trying. Amazing! We were delighted to add to our family, and thankful it was happening so easily. This was also the pregnancy where I first learned to deep dive. Initiation into the waves. For couples who choose to do so, one of the most thrilling moments in a normal pregnancy is finding out the gender of the baby during the mid-pregnancy morphology scan. But we knew something was wrong when the ultrasound technician rotated out for a more experienced sonographer, who then changed places with the doctor. We were stunned when a specialist pulled us into his office after the scan and began speaking out about our baby boy in a foreign language, trisomy 18, trisomy 13, incompatible with life, trisomy 21. Our baby had several markers that pointed to a chromosomal anomaly, but we couldn't be certain without further testing. The specialist explained our options, and we left nauseated by the thought of our child dying in utero, or the alternative he was gently offering. We left the hospital that day in a blur, begging God for the least severe option, Down syndrome, which the specialist said was our best case scenario. Devastation flattened us. Against doctor's orders, I Googled way too much. I also asked friends and family to pray. I journaled. I poured out my grief and fear before the Lord. I cried. I blubbered and snotted a lot. The thought of losing a baby horrified me. A few days later, we had a follow-up visit with another doctor. We entered nervously, desperately hoping for any news that might suggest that there was hope for our baby's life. As she unpacked the reports and stats and medical jargon, she clarified that the previous baby had misled us. In fact, the chances of our baby having a life-threatening anomaly, such as trisomy 13 or 18, were extremely low. It was much more likely he'd be born with Down syndrome, trisomy 21. Her assessment, though still difficult, was an enormous relief. We left thankful and weepy. Through the anguish of the not knowing and the powerlessness we felt over our circumstances, we began to learn what grief and suffering can do to a human soul. It stretches it wide open to fit all of the anguish and confusion and sorrow and humanity that's exposed. We had to dive deep in order to not be destroyed, and we did so together. Perfecting the duck dive. Surfers learn early on that unless they want to get swept back to shore, they have to learn to duck dive, take the whole surfboard and duck underneath the coming wave. Instead of trying to get over it or around it, they know the best way through is to go under. If they don't duck dive properly, they'll get pummeled. I've been surfing a few times. I wish I could tell you I'm a surfer, but I'm not. My first day surfing was on a giant longboard off the coast of San Diego, California, when I was 16 or 17 years old. I understood the weight distribution for my days of snowboarding powder where I grew up in Oregon. This was just warmer and wetter, right? The waves were small and consistent, perfect for a beginner, and my borrowed board was gigantic, making it almost impossible not to get up. Honestly, it was probably more like sailing than surfing. The only problem was I couldn't get out far enough to catch a wave. I simply couldn't get past the break. I understood the concept of duck diving, but I had no actual experience. I didn't have the technique, and I certainly didn't have the muscle to sink that bus of a surfboard under the ocean surface. After what felt like forever of paddling, heaving, and paddling some more, my friend finally told me to grab onto his ankle so he could pull me far enough out. He swapped my longboard for his shorty, and when it was time, I let go of his ankle and tried duck diving again. That time, I made it through in one piece, and much to my delight, I was still moving forward. And yes, I caught my first wave soon after. Here's what I learned about duck diving from the few surfing sessions of my youth. You must have forward momentum when you're diving. You can't be stagnant and then expect to duck dive successfully. You've got to paddle as much as you're able until the last moment before diving. 2. Just before the wave comes, you need to take a big breath. I guess this one's pretty self-explanatory, but it's amazing how we can sometimes forget to breathe, especially when it's most important. 3. As you dive, you lead with your hands, then your head, then your shoulders, and the rest of your body follows. 4. And last, push down with your knee as much as you can, and then lay flat on your board once you're under. If you nailed the technique, you'll naturally emerge on the other side of the wave, not only having survived it, but having moved forward. Why all this talk about surfing? Because this duck dive became an important metaphor for me as I learned to navigate the waves of grief that started with Judah's prognosis and continued through the miscarriages that followed. I had to find Jesus underneath the surface. Before our lives were interrupted with grief, my relationship with Jesus was good, rich even. To stick with the surfing analogy for a moment, you could say I wasn't a novice and yet had never faced big surf either. I was practiced at spiritual duck diving. I knew my life needed forward momentum and that I drowned without filling my lungs with God's presence. I also knew that at times my head and my heart didn't feel like connecting to Jesus, but if I just reached out my hands a little, my head and heart would follow. I also knew that once I was under the surface, I could stretch out and trust the process, relaxing into the confidence that I would emerge on the other side. But even though I knew how to go deep, my version of deep was about to be schooled. I needed to go way deeper. The break on the horizon was massive, and I was on a heavy longboard. The faintest yes. Here's where we have to deviate from the duck dive analogy for a moment. The reason is simple. When we are grieving, we don't need spiritual muscle to dive deep into Jesus. It helps if we've already developed muscle memory before being dropped into the North Shore, sure. It just sounds weird, but the grace of God means He isn't dependent on our strength, stamina, and precision. All it takes is our slightest desire, our faintest yes, and He draws us under. I suppose we've got to want to dive, but He meets us in the surrender. Our weakness releases His strength. His might is manifest in our dependence. People have a remarkable ability to endure hardship when they tap into their inner strength. But when the source of your inner strength comes from someone greater than yourself, the reservoir is more vast than you dared imagine. You'll find this as you grieve. Some days you'll have the strength to dive deep, and Jesus will meet you there. Other days you'll barely manage a nudge in His direction, and He'll meet you there too. His grace is big enough for both. Under the deep. As Ryan and I digested the prognosis for our son, the waves of fear and sorrow and grief came with crushing intensity, powerful and close together. But we learned to fill our lungs and dive deep into the safety of Jesus. We had no assurance for Judah's life or health, but we did have God's promise to stay with us under the waves. We were on the edge of transformation, and we could feel it. Grief invites us to a liminal space, a place to hold on to the comfort and presence of God while suspended between who you are and who you are becoming. Liminal spaces feel disorienting because they are. The word liminal comes from the Latin word limina or lemon and connotes the idea of a threshold, a space between what was and what will be. The implication is a moving forward into something new, but not without first being transformed by the in-between. Liminal spaces demand our attention, not just as a means to an end, but as a place of transformation. Richard Rohr describes a liminal space as being in between your old comfort zone and any possible new answer, and likens it to Israel in the desert, Joseph in the pit, Jonah in the belly, the three Marys tending to the tomb. This is the sacred space where the old world is able to fall apart and a bigger world is revealed, Rohr says. It's the threshold of God's waiting room. It did seem as if our old world was falling apart, but we were only beginning to catch glimpses of the new one. We felt the movements toward a certain kind of coming of age of our faith, realizing that God's goodness was not dependent on our assessment of our circumstances or the metrics we tend to use when life is comfortable. I don't know about you, but we are sometimes guilty of enjoying favorable circumstances or breakthroughs and proclaiming, "Isn't God good?" while conveniently forgetting to proclaim His goodness when life unfolds in ways that hurt. While this belief about God's goodness through all of life's circumstances wasn't new to us, the depth of understanding was. It was like learning to open your eyes underwater. Even though you know it's possible, it feels awkward, frightening, and cumbersome at first. And yet, the more you practice, the more natural and liberating it feels. Eyes wide open to God's goodness, especially when it feels risky, changes the way everything else looks to it. Deeper still. We learned about Down syndrome in measured doses as Judah's birth approached, attempting to cushion ourselves from overload or obsessing about what was still unconfirmed. I imagined myself as a mom of a child with special needs, And my thoughts slowly shifted from how it might affect our child and family negatively to how it might transform and enrich our lives as we learned to be changed by this little boy. We moved toward birth with expectancy and peace. And then he came. A week before his due date, I pulled our gorgeous son to my chest in adrenaline-soaked euphoria after an arduous 21-hour labor. It wasn't until 15 minutes later, when my brain caught up to my heart, that I realized he had been born without Down syndrome. All of that, for what? Those pregnant days of holding space for both grief and hope shaped us in ways, as a couple and as parents, that would become an anchor in the days to come. We learned to dive deep into Jesus and even open our eyes under the water, but we would need to go deeper still. Alright, so this is the end of part 1, and she's put a little journal prompt. So it says, before moving on to part 2, write out your own personal story of loss. Include as much detail as you can recall about what happened and how you felt. Don't worry about your writing skills or stop to edit. This is to help you remember, and you don't need to share it with anyone right now. Try to resist writing about lessons you learned or sermonizing to yourself with things you think you should write. Let this simply be an exercise in telling your story. I invite you to do that. I have done it, and I should probably look over it. It's been healing in the sense that I wanted to remember our baby, especially as time goes on and as we get pregnant again and have children of our own. I didn't want to forget this first chance and this first opening to being a mother and a father. And I found it, I wouldn't be as far in my journey, even though I'm not very far, it feels. I would not be as far, though, if I hadn't taken the time to write down the memories. I wrote down, learning we were pregnant, keeping it a secret, sharing with family that we were pregnant, and all, the ER experience, because I was like, this shaped us. It dramatically changed our lives. Not in the way we had hoped for, but it changed our lives. And it's just crazy how it happened back in January, and now it's May, when it feels still so raw to me. But I invite you to get a journal. I give you permission, if you are looking for permission, to get a journal and to write those memories. Even if it's just you. I've just written it. I did have John help me pick out. But of course, men and women are impacted differently, and I don't know your story. Maybe you are married. Maybe it's you and your boyfriend, or you and your fiance. Maybe you're by yourself, a single mom, or maybe you're a teen. I don't know. But it is very healing, and what you're feeling is valid. It's valid. And the struggle's real. You have your good days, you have your bad days. And that's how it is. What happened to you happened. And even though the world moves on, even though family moves on from this, you may not. In some ways you won't. It'll always be in the back of your mind. But I hope that you can share your story even if you're just writing it down, if you need a space to write it down in the comments. And I'll see you guys next time, okay? Bye.